When I was 25, I finally was like, the reason that my life never works out, the reason these relationships never work, the reason I'm never happy is because I was supposed to be a man. I had 2 major surgeries. I was on hormones for 9 years and thought that I would be happy living as a man. But I realized over time that no matter what I did, I could not be a man.
So often transition is about masking the real issues and trying to circumvent them without going through them.
Our feelings lie to us. Our feelings are not always accurate, but a lot of the reason that people feel this way is because it's based on emotional things that haven't been dealt with.
As soon as you find out that somebody is feeling as though they are gender dysphoric or believing that they are, and there's their behaviors and their feelings really align with that, then go ahead and write the script, and get them on this conveyor belt. And it just, to me, it's just so profoundly tragic that that's the way that we're handling this.
Various people will say, if you think you might be trans, go ahead and get your breasts cut off. And if you change your mind later, you can just get them put back on.
Studies show, actually, if you just leave kids alone, if you don't have people piping in their ear all this stuff about trans ideology and all this kind of thing, children, the vast majority of kids who experience gender dysphoria actually come to terms with their biology and become comfortable with their biology, even without intervention.
You are giving somebody opposite sex hormones. You are intentionally taking a healthy person and introducing a state of disease.
You're always supposed to say the positive thing about what you've done, but then when, like you're saying, everything else in their life, they say, oh, it's positive, 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 but then everything else in their life is falling apart, or many things are falling apart, and it's like there's a complete disconnect.
God called me to obey and to trust him and to walk by faith. Then as I walked by faith, God began to heal me.
Welcome to the Love and Truth Network podcast, your guide for hope and healing in a hurting world searching for truth. Here we explore God's extraordinary design for biblical sexuality, identity, and authentic community. You'll be impacted by incredible stories of transformation, practical wisdom from pastors and counselors, and the power of God's grace that changes lives.
Well, hey, everybody. Thank you for joining us for another episode of the Love and Truth Network podcast. We're so glad that you're here with us. Glad that you're tuning in now. This will be our second time of having the privilege of Laura Perry being with us for our podcast. I wanted to reconnect with her and just kind of pick up where we left off. She did a great job of sharing so much of her story, God's story in her life. We'll be talking about some of that again. I'm going to ask Laura if she would just kind of summarize a little bit of that, a little bit of a thumbnail. But if you go back and look for our previous podcast with me and Laura, you'll get a lot more information there. But I wanted to pick up and talk with her and focus really in this particular podcast around some of the issues related to health and concerns that we often don't hear about for people that are being encouraged or pushed toward so-called transition, believing that a boy was born in the wrong body, he should be a girl, or a girl should be a boy, or a man, a woman, a man, etc. And so quickly put on this kind of conveyor belt of transgender ideology, and so little being said about really giving informed consent. That's a huge concern of mine. I'm sure that's a concern of Laura's. It's a concern of so many that have gone into this arena, or those who love those that have gone into this arena, is how much informed consent has there actually been? Yes, the paperwork has been signed so that medical institutions and doctors and mental health providers can try to cover their butts in regard to a potential lawsuit down the road. But how much was really understood by children and certainly by parents as to what they were signing off on? We all have heard the horrible thing that so many mental health providers and others have said to parents when their children are in the throes of all kinds of depression and anxiety around these issues. And one of the statements that has gone out to parents is, do you want a dead daughter or a live son? Do you want a dead son or a live daughter? And it's just a terrible way of manipulating parents, I believe, into and causing them to panic about, if I don't do this, if I don't agree to what my child is saying that they think they want, that they become convinced of, if I don't agree with this, if I don't begin to support this idea of them so-called transitioning, then somehow I'm going to bring about their death, and it's going to be on my shoulders. And of course, I don't want that to be the case. And so there's a lot of manipulation and pressure that's felt by parents. And then later on, and I'm thinking of Chloe Cole, for example, she has come back and said, wow, she really recognizes how her parents were manipulated and how they were fearful for her life, and went along with this because of some of those kinds of statements. So we want to get into a lot of that with Laura today, and just kind of pick up with what the Lord's doing in her life, how he's using her story. So Laura, thank you so much for being a part for a second episode of the Love and Truth Network podcast.
Yeah, thank you for having me on. I'm so glad to be here.
Yeah, we really appreciate that. And, one of the things I would love for you to do is just give a little bit of a recap of your story. I want people to be able to go back and kind of listen to the bigger piece. I know it can be difficult sometimes to summarize something into something that was so impactful and so large into something that's a smaller summarization. But if you could do that, I would love to have you take a stab at it.
Sure. I was raised in a Christian home, and instructed in the Bible, and went to Christian youth group and Christian school, and so heard a lot about the Bible growing up, but didn't really have a relationship with Jesus. Just didn't really know Jesus, and didn't know that I didn't know. But so when God wasn't answering my prayers, or when I was disappointed or felt like my life wasn't working out, when trauma or brokenness would come in, I was always blaming God. Why isn't God fixing all these things? And I didn't really understand this broken world. And so, but I had a lot of anger. I had a lot of anger toward my mom. I blamed my parents for things, and was just a kind of a selfish child that was always trying to figure out why I was different, why I felt like I didn't fit in, and was really angry at God for making me the way that he did. I never liked myself as a girl. I felt like I didn't fit in. I always had a lot of health problems. I had a lot of weight problems because of it. But over the years, I was always wishing that I had been a boy. But back then, I had never heard the word transgender. I didn't have any concept of that. So I tried to fit in with the girls. So there was this wrestle of, I wish I'd been a boy, but trying to fit in. But when I was 25, I finally was like, the reason that my life never works out, the reason these relationships never work, the reason I'm never happy is because I was supposed to be a man. I had 2 major surgeries. I was on hormones for 9 years, and thought that I would be happy living as a man. But I realized over time that no matter what I did, I could not be a man. It left me more empty and broken than before. And so, but over those years, my mom was praying, and other people were praying for me, and the Lord just began to pursue me. And I look back, and God was watching over me the whole time, and putting people in my life, and sparing my life from all my dumb decisions. And God just began to rescue me. And when I came back to the Lord, I was just radically transformed, and ended up detransitioning. And once I did, and God began to heal all the anger and the bitterness, and I began to forgive people and let go of all those things, I started realizing that I wasn't a man, that I didn't like being a woman because I had so much anger. So as God healed those things, I began to lose my desire to be a man, and those feelings and desires just started fading away. And so God healed it by healing me on the inside first.
That's a great way of describing it. I really appreciate that. And I've followed several online detransitioners, and I've heard a number of them talk about this sensation that they say is pretty common among trans individuals, of this beginning process of whether it's social transition to start with, and then chemical hormonal transition, and then something surgical as well. Like with every new thing, maybe calling yourself by a different name, hearing other people use your preferred pronouns, that every time there was something kind of new that would move you toward this process of what you thought was transition, that there was this huge high that would happen. And then after a while, like the goalpost would shift. It was like, oh, I'm getting closer, and this feels wonderful. And I've also heard that testosterone, even for girls, for women, it can really have an impact, a feeling of positive impact initially
Oh
on
yeah.
their emotions too. So
Right.
describe some of the things that happen in terms of like that goalpost moving, of there being some real highs of moving toward your goal, and yet then again the goal shifting, and then you'd have to do something else to maintain that.
Yeah, that's such a great way to put it. And like you said, testosterone it's a drug, and I mean, it's naturally produced in the body. Even women produce a small amount,
Hmm.
but it to a girl especially, it has a massive effect on energy levels, on strength, and other things. And so you just feel like Superman. Like you
Hmm.
could do anything. Even if you give testosterone to a man, he's going to feel more vigorous, more
Yes.
energetic. It increases sexual drive, all of those things. And so all of that plays into this feeling of, oh, this is working. I feel so much better. And you get this euphoria, and you feel so much more different. You feel so much more alive. You feel so much more powerful. But over time, that starts to have a catastrophic effect on the body, because our there's hormone receptors all over the body, and our organs are designed for certain levels of hormones. In fact, I talked to an endocrinologist one time, and he said, my entire practice is to balance the hormones,
Mm.
because you are supposed to have a certain level of hormones in the body for whether you're male or female. And you can't change all your internal structure and organs and all those things to be the opposite sex. So he said, when you are giving somebody opposite sex hormones, you are intentionally taking a healthy person and introducing a state of disease.
Mm.
And he said it's extremely dangerous for a person to live in a prolonged state of being out of balance with your hormones. So what feels good initially eventually starts having a very negative effect on the brain, on other organs, depending on the person's development. Like if they're still in puberty and still developing, it can have
Mm.
massive effect on bone development. I read a study one time that said that the bone density of kids that have been on puberty blockers is like in the bottom 2%.
Wow.
And so it's just, it has so much effect on the entire body. So over time you start developing more and more health problems, and I see that a lot with trans people. And I also have observed that and unfortunately there's not a lot of studies. I wish there were way more medical studies, but in the studies that I have seen, or even in the people that I've known, there seems to be a decrease in mental health over time, not an increase, even though
Right.
initially there's an elation and excitement and all of that.
Yeah, it seems like the studies that have been done have focused on immediately after
Right.
surgery or very quickly after different milestones, and
Hmm.
there aren't longitudinal studies that show, from
Right.
my knowledge, that show positive outcomes for those that have gone through some series or process of some kind of transition, again all the way into top and bottom surgery, etc.
Yeah.
So you shared your story a little bit to start off here, but and you may have even kind of covered some of this, but I want to just ask you kind of specifically, like, what first drew you to this idea that you were questioning your gender identity? And then I'm also wondering, how quickly did professionals of whatever kind, mental health, physicians, what have you, how quickly did they begin to move you toward hormones and surgery?
I had those thoughts as a very, very young child. I don't know initially where they came from, other than, I can point to things like I was jealous of my brother. I was not as close with my mom. I was so close to my dad. I did everything with my dad. And we did what are more stereotypical boy things. I would go to car
Hmm.
races and things like that with my dad. But a lot of the girls didn't relate to that. So because I didn't have a great relationship with my mom, I didn't get along as well with girls. I kind of was nervous and awkward around them because I spent all my time with boys and was very athletic. I developed a lot younger. And so even as a child, I grew faster. I was the second tallest kid in my class. I was naturally stronger, and it made me good at sports. But sometimes the girls I had a hard time relating to them. So instead of trying, I would just go play sports with the boys. So I think it developed this sense in me early on that I was different, that I didn't belong. And for years, I thought that these girls rejected me, but I look back and I think it was just my own awkwardness because I just didn't know how to relate to them. But
Right.
it that lie got fed over time. Like every little experience would get kind of put through that filter. So any interaction that didn't go well with kids, whether it was positive with boys, it would be like, see, I belong with the boys. I remember, being 8 or 9 years old and getting picked for the kickball team at recess before 3/4 of the boys because I
You're
was
good.
bigger and stronger,
Yeah.
but or things wouldn't go well with the girls, and see, I don't belong with girls. And I was writing stories about being a boy in my head at night, or sometimes I would write them down. I wrote a lot as a kid, and I had this kind of vicarious character that I had that I was living through. And then I was playing video games of boy characters all the time. And I was always thinking of myself as a boy. And I always knew that I was a girl, but always wishing I had been a boy because I'd never heard the word transgender. This is in the late 80s, early 90s. But then when I was in high school, and I was trying so hard to find love in all the wrong places, and I was seeking the attention of men because I wanted to be with boys. That's where I was comfortable, but I faced a lot of rejection. I was dumped and I was used and abused, and I was rejected a lot because of my weight, and which has always been a huge struggle for me. And I just began to feel like I was never going to be a good enough girl, and got deep into sexual sin and pornography, just giving myself away to anybody who would pay attention to me. And it destroyed my my sense of self-worth or self-value. Just felt like I had nothing to offer other than to be used. I didn't feel like I would ever be loved. But it just reinforced everything I'd believed as a child. It's like, this all makes sense now. The reason that I'm never good enough for these guys is because I was supposed to be a man. But then when I went to a counselor and was talking to this, and I wasn't interested in counseling, so I did not go. I know a lot of people will go seek counseling. I just grew up with the stigma that only crazy people needed counselors. I just didn't understand the benefit, and wasn't the only reason that I went to a counselor or she was a licensed psychologist. The only reason I went is because I was told if I wanted to transition, then I had to have 3 sessions with this psychologist, and she would diagnose me with gender identity disorder, which back in 2007, this is before they changed the language to say gender, what is it now? Gender dysphoria. It was a diagnosed mental disorder. But so I was only trying to get this diagnosis in order to get started on the hormones. But in the 3rd session, she kind of stopped for a minute. She put down her notebook and looked over her glasses. I remember looking right at me, and she's like, "Wow, you really have issues with your mom." And I was stunned. I was like, "Whoa, wait a minute. How did we get from me talking about being a man to talking about my mother?" And I didn't realize the connection. And I blew up at her. I said, "I'm not here to talk about my mom." And I had a lot of deep anger toward her. Now that I'm older, I don't blame my mom at all. I misunderstood a lot of things. I believed a lot of lies. But at that time, I really had deep issues with my mom. And I think that's maybe where some of the early seeds started. And so she recognized that, but because I wasn't willing to talk about it, and I think she'd made the connection, but because of pressure from society or from whatever, she said, "So you're just here for this diagnosis?" I said, "Yes, that's all I want." And she said, "Okay," and just gave it to me. And I took that letter stating that I'd been diagnosed with this mental disorder, even though she knew that I had all these issues that had never been addressed. I'd never been in counseling. I don't think I'd ever even talked to a school counselor about this, or a pastor or anybody.
Right.
And then took this letter to a medical doctor that I'd been going to for years. I had never mentioned that I was transgender or felt like this. And he said, "Are you sure this is what you want?" I said, "Yes, this is what I want." And he gave me my first dose right there that day, and then gave me a prescription to do it myself after that.
Wow. I mean, that's incredible when you think about it. I mean, so many people today are not even saying what this woman said to you, that, wow, you have huge issues with your mom or any of that. They're just like, none of that
Right.
matters. That supposedly doesn't play into this at all. And so as soon as you find out that somebody is feeling as though they are gender dysphoric or believing that they are, and there's some their behaviors and their feelings really align with that, then go ahead and write the script, and get them on this conveyor belt. And it just, to me, it's just so profoundly tragic that that's the way that we're handling this. What would you say? I wonder what it would have been like for you if you'd had someone who you could have actually processed, someone that you trusted as a young person who is in the very early stages, beginning to feel like, why don't I fit in more with girls? I really love hanging out with the boys. And so often, there's nothing wrong with that in per se,
Right.
but so often the enemy can plant seeds of doubt in our own mind. Our own minds can go off in all kinds of directions. And over the course of time, we can build this whole case and this whole belief system that becomes very solidified and feels like concrete, but it's actually built on a house of cards because no one was there to kind of shepherd us through some of those difficult feelings and thoughts and assumptions that we make as children. Now, I mean, I know that you were there with your mom and your dad, and yet it doesn't seem like you made use of that.
Yeah, I didn't talk to a lot of to anybody. Part of my problem was that I had been molested by another boy when I was 8 years old, and I had never dealt with it. I had deep shame, and I didn't ever want to talk to my parents about it. I didn't tell my parents till I was in my 30s. And so this was like a major, even though it only happened one time, it really changed me. And it started me down this path of seeking sexual attention. And the few friends that I had, I always struggled fitting in, but the few friends that I had, I often ended up having sexual encounters with, and then I would lose my friends. But I was always seeking the attention of boys from a very, very young age. And I think a lot of it had to do with that. But I also, because of my health problems and my weight problems, and somebody that hasn't dealt with weight struggles as a child, it's very hard to understand what that's like for a child. And I was not a lazy couch potato. I was very athletic, and I was often playing 3 sports at a time. And my mom was always making me diet and all these things, and was just could never get it under control. And then once in a while, I would just about kill myself and finally get thin, and then I'd have all this attention from guys, and then I would but I couldn't maintain it very long because I would burn my body. I would burn out my adrenals. I'd have thyroid problems from all the extreme exercise and dieting, and then I would gain all the weight back. And so I developed an extreme self-hatred. I just couldn't stand looking at myself. Was angry. Just wanted to really hurt myself. And that was a lot of it. I was angry at God for making me a girl that had all these weight problems because I had so much rejection from it. And so I think that on top of already feeling like I didn't fit in, all the awkwardness and the shame from the secret that I carried, and I think that I was probably more tomboy and interested in more boyish things, but I think a lot of it had to do with my self-hatred. And I've heard from so many people. I've seen many comments on YouTube videos and other places where people have said, I felt like the opposite sex at some point in my childhood. I wished I had been the opposite sex, or I felt like that. That is a very normal childhood experience at some point when we're wrestling with who we are and why am I a girl or why am I a boy, and I like these things or whatever. And I didn't really realize until I was much older, really after I detransitioned, that I really am a woman. And now that I'm older and God has healed a lot of those things, and I'm not trying to compete, and I'm not looking for sexual attention from every guy that walks down the street, I'm a lot more comfortable in who I am. And I've realized that I actually fit in really well with women. I am such a girl. And, but it took, I think I had so much self-hatred that I was just really rejecting femininity.
Yeah, what I've learned, when you couple self-hatred, which I also experienced in very, very intense ways, with envy, that there's
Mhm.
this longing to be someone else, this longing to seeing and envy may start off as admiration to begin with, and
Yep.
then admiration can quickly become envy. It can be quickly become sexualized, and we're trying to kind of be wanting to become this other person that we admire or what have you. And you couple that self-hatred with that envy and sexualization, and wow, it really becomes this powerful cocktail for feeling, again, like concrete facts when it's really all based in these intense emotional experiences that we're having within. But those experiences directly cut against the reality of who we are biologically. So the other thing, as you're sharing, Laura, also, I just so relate to a lot of what you're saying. When I was in my probably just before puberty, in puberty, by the way, who loved going through puberty? I mean, as if every
Nobody.
child on the planet, if you feel awkward during puberty, maybe you're trans. Well, I mean, it's so ridiculous. There's not a person on the planet
Right.
who's loved going through puberty, maybe wanting to get to the other side of it, but going through it is always a challenge. But
Right.
somewhere before then, so for a couple of years, 2 or 3 years, I really experienced some deep sense of gender dysphoria as well. I really experienced this longing. It just made sense to me. I was with the girls
Right.
all the time. I got along with them all the time. I wanted to spend time with them. I wanted to spend time with boys, but I was afraid of boys. I
Yeah.
experienced sexual abuse at the age of 5 or 6 and early sexualization and all of that kind of thing. And I was also the opposite of you in terms of sports and all that. I was the one chosen last for the team, never
Yeah.
in the first 3 quarters, that's for sure. But I just began to feel like this doesn't make any sense, God. You had to have screwed up big time. I should have been a girl. That makes sense that I would have been. And of course, I never even heard the word transgender or anything back in that day. And so the fact that I didn't have all these competing voices and all these, teachers and counselors and popular media pushing me in this direction, there is zero doubt in my mind that if I had that stuff at 10, 11, 12 years old, there's zero doubt in my mind that I would have absolutely grabbed hold of that and felt like this makes sense. This is what I'm longing for. This is what I'm supposed to be. I can see how it's so compelling given my
Mhm.
own history and for a while even cross-dressing. Even there was a particular dress that I would put on. I would kind of wear it I did for a couple Halloween seasons, but even in between those couple Halloweens, I would put that dress on whenever I could when no one was around the house, which wasn't very often.
Mm.
But I would put that dress on and just pretend and believe that I was a girl. Again, it just made sense to me.
Right.
So for me, you're a detransitioner. I would be considered as a desister, and
Right.
I think that that's more common many times. Like you said, this it isn't uncommon for people to feel like I should have been the other gender. Not everyone feels that way, obviously, but when you have a society now that has people in positions of authority and power who are supposedly the experts telling us that this is perfectly normal, that you simply need to go through these surgical procedures, these hormonal treatments, whatever, and you can actually live out your best life. I mean, that's kind of how it's portrayed. It's very compelling for children and very confusing for children.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think what you said is so powerful. And I think we want to re-emphasize. I have seen over and over and over in so many stories this combination of self-hatred and envy. And it's this: I don't fit in, I don't like myself, I don't like whatever about myself.
Right.
And it's that person has what I want. But the longer that we envy that person, you're right, it often becomes sexualized. And in Romans, I'm trying to think of which chapter. I think it's in Romans 7, where Paul equates lust or covetousness to lust. And I had never made that connection until I was reading that one day, and Paul said, I would not have known what lust was unless the law had said, thou shalt not covet.
Mm.
And I think underneath lust is really about coveting what doesn't belong to us. It's funny now that it's when you really think about it, though. I've heard so many young people, including myself, say it would have been so much easier to be the opposite sex or whatever. We think those things, but actually, now that I look back, I mean, it's hard for both in different ways, because you hear the same things from boys who wish they were girls, and you're like, no, that wasn't easier for girls. Girls could be vicious. I don't know if many guys realize how mean girls are to each other.
Mm.
A lot of boys don't realize, that they look at girls and maybe they're friends with girls, and they have they get along well at times, but what they don't realize is there's so much competition with girls that is, I think, natural, especially as we go in, start getting into puberty. And by natural, I don't mean it's right, but there's so much competition between girls as we're competing for the affection of boys, wanting to be better than each other. And there's so much like cattiness and just there's so much extreme emotions when girls are going through puberty. I remember, for example, one time, and I don't think this was even because I was acting more like a boy. I went through phases where I tried to be really feminine, and the dysphoria would kind of ebb and flow a little bit. But I had never heard the word transgender back then. So it's not like I thought that was a possibility. But I remember one time in middle school where I had lost a bunch of weight. I finally was in with the popular crowd. Like, this was everything I'd been working for years. And I gave out some Christmas presents to some of my new friends in this really popular crowd that I'd wanted to be in for so long. And I remember when I walked away, I heard the girl talking to her friend, and she laughed, and they said she actually thought we were friends. And those are the kind of things that, like, a lot of people, we look at other people and we make a lot of assumptions, and envy often looks at something and says, I wish I was like that person, or I wish I was in that situation, or I wish I had that body, or whatever. But we don't know what that person's actually going through.
Right.
Even as a Christian and as a speaker now, I've had so many people that think I am on some kind of elevated platform as a Christian because I was speaking and on stages and stuff. No, I still have all kinds of issues, but sometimes we don't see what's really going on in people's lives. But we tend to look at something we desire and we think, if I could just achieve that, then I will be happy.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. No, I hear you. And I also wonder, you talk, I know I've heard you talk in interviews about how social media had an impact on your life in terms of buying into kind of the narrative that's out there now. And what was that like for you? What did you kind of get drawn into that you mentioned video games. I don't know if any of those were kind of online video games, or what kind of social media did you get caught up in that had an impact on you?
Well, back then it wasn't as much social media. Media has changed back then, but it was just other types of media. Like, I played a lot of video games. I didn't like, this is weird, I don't know why. I was a pretty serious gamer, you would say. I played endless hours of video games, but I never liked the social video games where I would, where you're online with other people.
Okay.
I think I always had this thing where I didn't trust other people I always wanted to be like super independent. But what I did start to get into was virtual sex games. Initially, I had a huge pornography addiction. And then as I started to get into these virtual sex games, I could like become this character, and I could walk around in this virtual world, and there were other people online with these virtual characters. And then the other thing was just reading tons of stories from other trans people and going, wow, this fixed their problem. Now they're happy. And it was interesting as when I went to a support group meeting that I found in where I was living in Tulsa. And these people that were all saying, there was a group of maybe 10 people, depending on how many were there that night, but they would always say, I'm so glad I transitioned. I don't have any regrets. This is the best decision I've ever made. And they would repeat that every week. Oh, I'm so glad I transitioned. But then when they would just talk about their life, their job, their family, their relationships, everything else was a disaster. I'm so depressed. And it was like, we quit going to my partner and I met my partner through the group. And he was a male living as a female, so we were both trans. But we stopped going to the meetings after about a year or so because everybody at the meeting was depressed, and we would leave the meeting more depressed than when we got there, because even though everybody's saying how happy this makes them, it gives you those euphoric feelings because you're able to kind of reinvent yourself, and you don't have to deal with that broken person that you hated, that you didn't like, so you can kind of be whoever you want to be, but it didn't actually fix anything else in their life.
Mm. Well, that's such a great point that you're raising, and I honestly I can't help but wonder. The truth is you're supposed to toe the line, and you're supposed to, everyone knows that you're supposed to be euphoric about all of this. And if and for those that I've known who have decided or even began to question, have I chosen the right thing? Is this really what I'm supposed to be doing? Man, people, nobody gets kicked to the curb faster than somebody who began to pursue like a transgender identity. And as soon as you start to question that, or if you start to move away from that, all of a sudden, like all those friends and all those people that were celebrating you and supporting you, they weren't really celebrating you from what I see. They were celebrating what you were doing that reinforces what they were
Yes.
doing and they believed in. And so you're always supposed to say the positive thing about what you've done. But then when, like you're saying, everything else in their life, they say, oh, it's positive, positive, positive. But then everything else in their life is falling apart, or many things are falling apart. And it's like there's a complete disconnect about what this has done for them, or what this has done to
Right.
them, rather.
Yeah, it really is a cult mentality. And as long as you agree with the things that we're teaching and
Yes.
saying, then you're part of the group. But as soon as you have any dissent, then you're out or you're persecuted or, but you also, I was thinking about the fact that you never hear what happens to the people that leave for the most part, unless they are speaking out. Like there's a handful that do, but
Yeah.
there are so many people that leave the transgender lifestyle that we never hear about. And I remember when I was living as trans, maybe 3 or 4 years in, there was this one particular, she was a biological girl, but was living as transgender, and she had had chest surgery and everything. And of course, I knew her going by male pronouns at the time, but I heard about that she detransitioned and one day just dropped out of the group, kind of distanced herself from anybody. I never heard anything else from her. Have no idea what happened. Have no idea why she detransitioned. And all those years, I wondered what made her leave that lifestyle. And I would always say, oh, that's crazy. I would never, like, there, no matter what happens, I'm never, ever, ever going to leave this lifestyle. I would never go back to being a woman. And it's because there was so much pain, because as miserable as I was living trans, I mean, there were times that I would be really euphoric. There were times, especially early on, that I loved it, that I would love looking in the mirror and seeing myself as a man for the first time. But there was always this, sense of, I haven't quite arrived. Like, there's always this elusive happiness out there. If I could have another surgery, if I could have this or that, then I'll be happy. So I was
Kind of
always
the
kind of
goalpost would
chasing
move, like
that.
we were talking about earlier, right?
Right,
The
right.
goalpost kept moving. Yeah.
Yeah. But I didn't think I would ever go back, because no matter how bad things got, no matter how depressed I got, because I realized that I couldn't be a man and that there weren't, like, I began to realize at one point that the surgeries could not make me a man. They could not give me a male body. They could make it look like a male body, but they couldn't give me a male body. And I
Hmm.
began to get really angry. And so I got really depressed after that. But it was like, well, at least I don't have to see myself as a woman, because I had such intense, deep hatred of Laura and of the woman that I'd been created. And so it really wasn't until I came to the Lord that I came out of that lifestyle. But I see there are thousands of kids detransitioning and coming out of those lifestyles because they realize that didn't fix the problems, but they're just going into some other kind of brokenness because they haven't fixed the underlying issues.
Right.
And so I see so many of these kids. There's a forum that I was part of called, it was just called Detrans on Reddit. And last time I looked, there was over 50,000 members. And of course, I'm sure there are some trolls on there, but it's supposed to be only
Yep.
people who have detransitioned or are thinking about detransitioning. And there are just hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of posts of kids saying, why didn't ever anybody stop me? Why didn't anybody tell me the truth? Like, why did somebody let me cut my breasts off? I was 14, and
Yes.
just heartbreaking stories. And so much of the time they said, I had trauma. I was dealing with this. I had been sexually assaulted or, whatever. And there's always something. But unfortunately, what's happening, because we're not getting these kids the counseling they need, we're giving them this Band-Aid solution that is going to make them feel better for a moment, but it's not fixing the reason they don't
Yep.
like themselves in the first place. And so they just end up saying, well, I was really gay, or, whatever else, or they, become alcoholics, or they get into drugs, or they get into whatever it might be, because they haven't fixed the underlying problems. And
Yep.
that's where we talked about earlier, the need for counseling, the need for therapy, because
Mhm.
the truth is, we have to help people learn not only to accept themselves, but really to learn others more than self. I think part of the problem in the church sometimes is that, especially in the late 90s, I don't know if you remember, there was a big push of self-esteem. You got to
Oh
you
yeah.
got to help your child's self-esteem. And I mean, there's some truth to that we want to help us have a positive view of self. But I think the problem is we tend to love ourselves more than others, and we want to exalt ourselves above others.
Yeah,
I
we tend
remember
to overcorrect.
yeah, I remember, for example, in seventh grade. Seventh grade was an awful year for me, and I was very depressed. I was very overweight, and just had so much self hatred. Was very suicidal in seventh grade, and really not because I was thinking about being trans at that time. It was more, I just hated myself, and but I remember
Mhm.
looking around and I really didn't have a lot of friends at the time, and was desperately wanting to be in the popular crowd, like I mentioned earlier. That But in seventh grade, I remember looking around the lunchroom, and there were several kids that didn't have anybody sitting with them. They were kind of the outcasts of the school. Nobody really liked them or wanted to be around them. And I remember thinking, I could go sit with those kids, and then they would have a friend, and then I would feel better. But I didn't want the popular kids to look down on me any more than they already were, because I was trying to get in that group, and I thought that
Yes.
would solve my problems. And that's what we need to teach these kids. Yes, love yourself, but really we need to love others, and how to serve one another, how to sacrifice ourselves for others.
Well, it reminds me of what Abigail Schreier writes about in her most recent book, Bad Therapy, and how, there's never been a time in history, and of course, we know this from lots of other sources, but there's never been a time in history when people have had greater access to counseling than what we do right now. Everybody's in counseling. So many people are in counseling, and yet anxiety levels and depression are off the charts, and so
Right.
much dysfunction going on. So I totally agree that my wife's is a licensed counselor. I totally agree that we need counseling, that's a very important piece. But yet Abigail seems to be arguing in her book that we are pathologizing children, that we are constantly
Mhm.
getting children to think about themselves all the time, how they're
Right.
feeling. And by asking these questions and getting them ruminating on all the negativity all the time, we're actually helping them to get into a place where they're just thinking about themselves constantly. And part of what you're talking about is rightly so. Totally agree with you as a dad of two teenage boys. The more that we can get outside of ourselves and look toward the needs of others, have compassion toward others, be considerate of others, the more joyful we actually are, which of course is a biblical
Right.
principle too. But I'm thinking, Laura, as we're talking, here I am. I've been married now 18 years. You're married now as well. I'd love you to tell a little bit about that story. Been married for a little over 18 years. My boys are in their teens, 14 and 16 years old, and I am so grateful. I mean, beyond measure for the life that God has given me. I can't even believe that I've had the privilege of
Right.
living the last, 20 years of being involved in ministry and meeting my wife and being married to her and having these boys in the family that we have and the ministry I lead and all that. So I look back on the rest of my life, and there was so much upheaval and emotional challenge and
Yeah.
self-hatred and all those kinds of things as you're talking about. But it also brings me back to what I started saying earlier about my own struggles with gender dysphoria, thinking I should have been a girl. You know, studies show actually if you just leave kids alone. Now I think kids do need counseling, but if you don't have people piping in their ear all this stuff about trans ideology and all this kind of thing, that children, the vast majority of kids who experience gender dysphoria, actually come to terms with their biology and become comfortable with their biology even without intervention. And that's what I experienced. That's where I didn't have any a counselor in my life. But something else that you said that I just want to underscore, I carried so much brokenness, not transgenderism, that really faded, and gender dysphoria, I desisted in that. But I carried so much brokenness forward into my adult years, even as a Christian, even as one involved went to a Bible college, all those things. I carried so much brokenness forward until I had someone pastorally and counseling and different groups that I got involved in, where I began to finally unpack the junk and the garbage that I've been dealing with since for as far back as I could remember. And so, again, I just want to underscore, studies show that children will actually, the vast majority, will desist from their feelings of gender dysphoria over time. But I think in order to really have the kind of health that you and I are talking about, that Jesus can lead us toward, that we do need people that we can open up to and talk to. And for those people also, which so many today, both non-believers and even so many that claim to be Christians, are toting and supporting an LGBTQ perspective, and even raising the question with people that, well, maybe this is actually the issue that you're experiencing. Maybe you actually are trans. Maybe this is something that you should be exploring. And when you insert those ideas into people's minds when they're already dealing with a mental health issue, and maybe a variety of sorts of issues, you're really doing a massive disservice to them.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think you're exactly right that, you brought up an important point that I have never thought about. And I think it's so true for all these kids. But when I was a kid, it wasn't as much. We didn't talk about mental health much. But my mom had had 2 miscarriages between me and my older brother. And with the second one, they were like 4 and 5 months along. So she had carried them about halfway through it. And she almost died with the second one. She had a near-death experience and was like floating up above her body, which she didn't even believe in, that kind of stuff. It was terrifying to her. And she heard the doctors arguing about what to do for her. So this was an extremely traumatic experience. But she also, my mom blamed herself. She felt like God didn't trust her to be a mother. And so she had so much brokenness over these miscarriages that, of course, I didn't understand as a child. But I think she was terrified that I would die. And my entire childhood, my mom, and I did legitimately have health problems. I was always sickly. I didn't have a great immune system, but my mom obsessed over my health. And I was asked all the time how I was feeling. How are you feeling? How is your body doing? And I just became obsessed and thinking about my body and how I was feeling 24/7. And it was very difficult. I don't think I was aware as much of other people's needs because everything was always about me and what I was feeling. And so that's even been hard now in my adult life. And of course, now I have some really serious health problems that are far worse. And it's really difficult sometimes to get beyond that. But I think it just brings up a good point that for these kids who maybe they are genuinely feeling certain ways, but they're one thing I've discovered is that our feelings are heavily influenced by brain chemicals. I mentioned earlier off air when we were just talking that I've got some pretty serious brain problems going on. I'm having all kinds of cognitive issues. Doctors are still trying to figure out why. We know part of it is massive brain inflammation, but we don't really know. But the point is, I have all kinds of episodes where I can be totally fine, and then all of a sudden, for no reason at all that I can point to, nothing has happened, but all of a sudden I can be really angry to where I want to throw things, punch walls, and I'm like, what in the world is going on? Or I can be extremely depressed, or sometimes I get this intense euphoria, and I feel just amazing. And then I'll start having these bad struggles where I can't talk and I can't walk and all these. So it's like a precursor to whatever's going on in the brain. So I started to discover that our feelings are heavily influenced by brain chemicals, not only in somebody who's struggling with health like I am, but even in a normal person. Sometimes we have brain imbalances, and there's all kinds of studies now coming out about how social media and just scrolling, things like that, can also
Right.
cause a lot of depression. Too much dopamine can cause depression when we're constantly being entertained and things like that. So there's all kinds of things that influence those feelings. And when we're always trying to point to some kind of reason that we're feeling these certain things, again, there may be legitimate needs. If kids have been through trauma, they've been abused, or there's been divorce, things like that, kids need to be able to talk about those things. But if we're constantly talking about mental health and why we don't feel good and certain things, when they may just need to go outside, they may need to get involved in a sport, or they may need to, I think one of the things that we should help kids more is to be involved in some kind of, not a job. I'm not talking about child labor, but to go volunteer for something,
Yes.
and to
Right.
think about somebody besides themselves.
Yeah, I think those are such great points, which really feeds right into my next question. And some of this might be a little repetitive, but I want to know specifically. I'd love for you to answer specifically, what kind of physical, mental, or emotional harms do you feel like you experienced from the hormones or surgeries that? And I know you can't associate these directly necessarily, but what are some of the things that you feel like have had an impact on you that you didn't have any idea about, you weren't told about before the so-called hormone treatments or before surgery?
Yeah, I because of my health problems all my life, it is difficult for me to say. But I know that when I was on testosterone, it over time, at first I felt great, but over time, my autoimmune stuff started getting worse, and I was having a lot of cognitive issues even back then, before I started having all the brain problems I have now, which I think at least is in part from working in a moldy building for several years. But I know I was having a lot of cognitive issues. And I remember even thinking, like, what's wrong with me? Like, I was not like this before. I'm amazed I didn't get fired from my job, because I just was not thinking well. I was always forgetting things, and just over the years was having more and more trouble. But I also had, I have a lot of shoulder and chest pain from the chest surgery. Like, I'm very rounded here. And I had a doctor time, he was a plastic surgeon, not the one that gave me the original surgery, but a different plastic surgeon, and said that it appeared, at least, that the plastic surgeon, to make it look more like a male chest, had actually cut part of the muscles there. And
Mm,
I have a lot of pain there. My chest hurts all the time. I mean, not intensely, but it just feels like phantom pains, kind of. We hear about people that have had limbs cut
mm,
off, and they talk about phantom
right.
pains. Sometimes it feels like I still have breasts there, but they're not there. But it's just kind of an aching. And then I tried to have breast implants put back in when I got married, and we had to have them taken out about a year later because I was getting so sick. And we thought initially that was causing all my health problems. It was at least part of it. And it was causing massive inflammation and all kinds of, my body just rejected that. So they don't tell you, because I've heard them tell kids, various people will say, if you think you might be trans, go ahead and get your breasts cut off. And if you change your mind later, you can just get them put back on.
Oh,
There are, and this is, I always say, it's not Mrs. Potato Head. You can't just pop on and pop off parts. And there are thousands of women who are talking about breast implant illness that weren't even trans necessarily. I was on a huge Facebook group. I can't remember how many members. I think, if I remember right, it had about 200,000 members of women that have experienced breast implant illness, because you're putting these foreign objects in your body. And
yeah.
then I also experienced, I've experienced some like bladder issues that doctors have told me are because I had a hysterectomy. other gut issues, because everything kind of moves around. There's space where there shouldn't be space, for one thing, but it also really affects my hormones. I know my hormones are way out of whack, but every time I've tried to balance my hormones now, I just end up with more problems, and it's because there's things missing that shouldn't be missing, and especially at my age, I was 29 or 30, somewhere right in that range. But then also, when I was single, I wanted to have children one day. I hoped that I would have children, but it wasn't a huge deal. It was like, wish I could have had children. Oh, well. But when I got married, that desire was so intense. And I longed to have a child with my husband. And I just didn't understand the spiritual implication there of when you're married in covenant with God and with, one man and one woman in covenant with God. And that desire was so much more extreme than it ever had been before. And so I cried myself to sleep for many, many, many months. Every single night would just cry and cry. And that was extremely hard for me. And I was not prepared for that burden. I knew that when I had a hysterectomy, that I wouldn't be able to have children. But again, I think, a teenager or even a young adult who's never been married, who has not had children, has no idea what that desire is like until that desire gets awakened.
Yeah, there you go. I mean, that really is the bottom line. You don't know what that desire is like until that desire is awakened. And you've also talked about just how detransitioners don't often, or rather, many detransitioners, including yourself, you've talked about how we're masking our issues. You've said this earlier today, but I just want to give you or earlier in our interview, I just want to give you another chance to kind of reprise that, speak into that so often transition is about masking the real issues and trying to circumvent them without going through them. Speak to that issue of how so many people are being drawn in from your perspective into this ideology for the sake of avoiding the other stuff, either consciously or subconsciously avoiding the trauma in their own life.
I think it goes back to what we talked about earlier about not liking self, hating self for whatever reason has gone on, whether it's trauma, brokenness of some kind, or being angry at God for the way he made us or what he's allowed in our life, and being envious of others. But then when those things aren't dealt with, we can't just suppress it and make it go away. It has to go somewhere. And so it festers. And I think so often these kids, and especially I think one thing that has really been harmful is all these video games that don't seem like a big deal, but there's a lot of studies saying that it rewires the brain, that they have negative impacts just cognitively. But more importantly, I think it allows kids to live vicariously through other characters, to kind of invent themselves. Most of these games, you can be whoever you want to be. I remember playing games, even if it wasn't necessarily like, sometimes I would play like The Sims or something where you have like this virtual life, but even like shooter type games, and you could choose whether you want to be male or female, and you could choose what color skin and what color eyes and hair, and you could make yourself really muscular or really thin or big breasts or whatever you wanted. And I think it sold this lie to our kids that they could be whoever they wanted, and not just in the games. Actually, I don't know. A lot of these, I think a lot of kids have been told all their lives, you can be whoever you want to be. You can do whatever you want to do. Now, of course, the parents probably didn't mean that they could be the opposite sex, but the truth is we can't be whoever we want to be. I mean, that sounds really good on a fortune cookie or something, but like I will never be in the NBA, no matter how bad I want it. Or as a kid, when I was 8 years old, I would tell people that I was going to be the first girl in the NFL. I am so glad that God didn't allow me to be a professional football player. I would have been creamed. No matter how bad I wanted that, I could have practiced for, every day, all day long. I would have never made it. That's not who I was. It's not who I was created to be. And I was never going to have the body for that. But the point is that, we try to we try to tell kids they can be whoever they want to be rather than helping them seek who God created them to be, because
Right.
God has an amazing plan for their life. But when we're just masking all the trauma and we're burying it, we're not solving the problem, and they become more and more broken. But what happens is when these kids have been convinced that the reason that they're not happy, the reason they don't like themselves, is because they were supposed to be transgender, and then they go down this road and they take hormones and they have surgeries, and then they realize at some point that there's no pot of gold at the end of the rainbow. There is no magic pill that is going to make them the opposite sex. And I remember there was always this elusive happiness. Well, maybe another year of hormones, maybe once my beard comes in, maybe once my voice is a lot lower, whatever it was at that time that I thought would make me happy. I remember when I got to, I was looking at the genital reassignment surgery, so-called, and I was horrified when I realized how bad these surgeries are, how artificial it is, that this was not ever going to make me a man. I remember even like realizing that I would never father a child, and then that seemed obvious at that time that I should have known that, but it just never occurred to me. I just never thought it through, or that I would have to artificially use this. Well, I don't want to get into too much detail, but it's just not real what they do to these kids, and it is horrific, and there's all kinds of complications. I've heard so many horror stories. They say that large percentages, I don't know if it's changed any now in recent studies, but when I looked it up back then, is that 40 to 60% would lose all sexual feeling permanently. And you're talking, so you've given these girls testosterone for years. I had a raging sex drive, and then you're want to give them these surgeries that could possibly make them lose all sexual feeling. And just all through these years trying to have sexual encounters with, and I had a partner as if I'm a man, was an extremely, endlessly frustrating process. I spent thousands of dollars on fake genitalia, trying to make something that was real. And then when I finally look at these surgeries and realize that these aren't real, and I was so angry. And I remember it's like I've been running a marathon and then I get to a dead end sign. There's no finish. There's nowhere to go. Or like I heard another trans person describe it as going to an amazing vacation destination, but the plane never lands, and you're just perpetually on this plane. There's no solution to it. There's no end to it. There's nowhere you can arrive that will make you into the opposite sex. I don't know. Have you ever heard of a man named Blair Logsdon?
I have not.
I had the privilege of talking to this man named Blair Logsdon several years ago over the phone. I never got to meet him in person, but he set the Guinness World Book of Records for having the most transition surgeries, and he has since passed away. But he was, and most of them were cosmetic, but he did have genital reassignment surgery 3 times. So he had tried to make it look like a female genitalia and then regretted it and tried to go back, and that failed. And so he went back to female genitalia, but he ended up with over 100 surgeries between all the facial stuff and vocal surgery and breasts and all kinds of stuff. And he said it was never enough. It never turned him from a man into a woman. And I think that is the problem, is that we're giving these kids a false solution. This will never solve their problems. It will never make them happy. It will for a time. Anything new is exciting. Any new adventure in life makes us feel good. But ultimately, it's not going to bring any lasting solution, and it's not going to solve the deeper problems.
So, Laura, what would you say changed when you became serious about faith? Not just the upbringing that you and I both had, where, again, I supposedly was a Christian too. I wasn't, not until the age of 23, but lots of Christian stuff and background and going through the motions. But when you really gave your life to Christ, what changed for you?
I really wasn't pursuing the Lord for so long. I didn't want God, but God kept pursuing me. And
Yes.
that's what amazes me about this whole story. I think most people have misperceptions of God. I think most people see God as this angry tyrant just waiting to like beat us into submission and force us to obey. And that's the opposite of the truth. God gives us
Mhm.
a choice. That's the whole reason this world is broken, is because God gave man a choice.
Yes.
But um, but my parents were praying, and God kept revealing Himself to me. God kept putting people in my life that were Christians, and God kept showing me who He was. And I had just all kinds of encounters with the Lord through dreams, through things I would hear over the radio, people He put in my life, and God really began to draw me to Himself and show me that He was good. And I just began to really change my perspective of who God was. And when I began to see God for who He truly was, not only was He loving, but that He's perfectly holy, that He's good, that He's just, that He's righteous, that all of these amazing things, and how um, all the miracles and things He did, but also all throughout the Old Testament, how He would tell the people, if you will only turn back to me, I will save you, I will rescue you. And He had so much patience and so much mercy on these people. But I saw that God was continually faithful. No matter how much they rebelled, no matter how much they turned away, He was faithful to them. I remember that really changed my perspective toward God. And it was also toward my mom during those years, who I had hated and had so much anger toward. My mom really began to pursue the Lord during the years I was trans. She had been a Christian for much of her life, but during those years, she really began to pursue Jesus in a different way. Instead of trying to be good enough for God and she said she was always on this like performance treadmill for God, she allowed the Lord to change her. And when she allowed the Lord to change her, then I began to see what God was doing in her. It took many years, but over the years, I would see what God was doing, and I would see how she was changing. And when God really opened my eyes to what He'd done in her, I was like, I knew the gospel was true, because I could see His transforming power in her. And this wasn't her plan. Like, she had tried to fix me for years, but when she really surrendered me into the Lord's hands and allowed God to pursue me instead of getting in His way and trying to fix everything for God,
Right.
God began to pursue me, but He also began to change my mom. And then He used what He was doing in her. But then I came to the Lord. I gave my life to Jesus, and I got radically saved. I was so transformed. God really began to change me from the inside out. And for the first time in my life, I wanted to pursue the things of God. I didn't feel forced anymore. I felt forced as a kid, but now I really wanted Jesus. And I could, as He was healing me, as He was changing my heart, I had so much joy and peace that I'd never had. And I really loved Jesus, but I wanted to hold on to my trans identity because I didn't want to be a woman. I hated Laura. I didn't want to go back to being Laura. And it just felt like if I went back to being Laura, then I had to hate myself again. And I didn't realize, people always say that we need to embrace our true selves. The Bible says we are to deny ourselves. And that's ultimately what the Lord, I shared more in my testimony on the first podcast, but the Lord called me to deny myself and to lay it down. And that was really hard. But in that, I didn't realize the healing that God was going to bring. I thought I would be miserable the rest of my life. But as He began to heal me, as I began to let go of all the bitterness and the anger, God just began to change me and transform me. And I, for the first time in my life, began to love who I was. And I began to love being a girl. And I thought I would be single the rest of my life, because I thought, what Christian man especially is going to want to love a girl like me with a past like mine, who didn't have breasts and I couldn't have children and all this. But God brought an incredible man into my life that you see in this picture back here. We were
Yes.
married about 3.5 years ago. And it has been an incredible journey. And what has been amazing with all of my brain problems, and it's really hard to describe. I've tried to describe it to people, and just to like sometimes I can't walk, I can't talk very well, and my emotions get really, really extreme. There's times that my body feels so much pressure inside that I feel like I just want to get out of my body. There's times that I've had episodes of like screaming and don't know why, but it just feels like something very bad going on in the brain. So my husband has had a lot to deal with. And to see this man love me, not only through my past, but, loving me in spite of all those things, but loving me in a marriage where my health has been an extremely difficult challenge, and seeing just unconditional Christ-like love.
Yep.
So I'm incredibly grateful. And, if I hadn't, but I had to do the hard thing first. The Lord, I've heard from so many trans people, if God will change or gay, or whatever they're dealing with, if God will change my feelings, then I will obey. But God called me to obey and to trust him and to walk by faith. Then as I walked by faith, God began to heal me.
Yes, that's right. I want to loop back for a moment. This thought has come to me a couple of times as we've been talking about. I want to loop back to the experience that you had with this therapist who saw something about some big issues with your mom and stated it, but then realized you're just here to get the letter. And when I hear that, that's so tragic to me, because to me, ethically, the right thing to do would be for her to explain, Laura, these are the reasons why this can be so important. And we've just scratched the surface. We haven't even gotten into much of your past or background. These are just some things that I am seeing, and I'm not pushing you to do anything with them. I just want you to know that these can have huge impacts in your sense of well-being and how you're kind of operating and living your life and how you're feeling, etc. And to say, I am really willing, if you'd be willing to meet with me over the next 10 sessions, let's say, I would love to meet with you and see if there's some things that we can unpack. And chances are, in the place that you were in, you would have just gotten up and been like, honey, forget it. I'll just go find somebody else. But if there were enough counselors who would actually do that, if there were enough counselors who would say, of course, I'm not going to give you a letter that this is what you're dealing with, because we haven't even begun to unpack your background, your history, your trauma, any of that, and how this could be affecting you in this way. What do you wish this woman would have done for you, or you'd like to see more counselors doing today?
Yeah, you're right. By the time I got to that point, I probably would have said, I'm out of here. I'm not here to, I already told her, like, I'm not here to talk about my mom. But if all of the counselors would do that, to say, no, there are issues that we want to work through first. And then, like, if an adult really wants to do this and they've been informed, that's their decision. But if we could make every effort to work through trauma, to work through a person's issues, to help them heal, to say, we need to at least work through this first. I mean, at least I had to have 3 at the time. Most people now don't even have to have therapy sessions.
No.
But I remember one of the things that was really surprising when I look back, not only did she just kind of say, okay, years later, I went to apply for a security job. And I had to put on the form if I'd ever had any kind of mental diagnosis. Well, because I did, I checked on there that I'd had a diagnosed mental disorder, and I had to get a letter stating from the therapist stating that this would not affect my job performance. So I went back to her, and she was like, you didn't have to put that on the form. And I was like, what do you mean? She said, I never turned that into anybody. That's not in any medical record. She had never, I guess because I didn't have insurance, she didn't have to, but she had never even put it on any kind of medical record that I was diagnosed with this. All I had was a letter stating that this was true. And I think she knew the truth, that I was not, and first of all, nobody's born in the wrong body.
Yes.
But, people may feel that way, but, our feelings lie to us. Our feelings are not always accurate, but a lot of the reason that people feel this way is because it's based on emotional things that haven't been dealt with. And I think it goes back to what we've said several times, but I want to reiterate. I think envy is a huge part of gender dysphoria. They're envious of, whoever it is in their life that they wish they were more like. Or another thing that I really commonly see is where one parent is either absent or abusive or maybe is really scary. There's a lot of like really sensitive boys who are really almost scared of their father. Even if he's not abusive, he just seems
Right.
like very manly and very, that can be intimidating to a young boy. Um, but or maybe they just get along better with their mother and their sisters, but it doesn't mean that they're trans. But over time they start hearing things like, oh, you're so much like girls, or you fit in so well with the girls, or that gets reinforced over and over and over and over until people believe this. But no one's born that way. There is a sense in all of us that all of us are broken. All of us have something wrong with our bodies. And in fact, the reason that our bodies feel so weird and awkward and foreign is because our bodies are under the curse of sin. We were created for the Garden of Eden, but we were exiled from Eden. All of us are born into a broken, sin-cursed world. Romans 8 says that all of creation is groaning under the curse of sin. And, that's why that Jesus said we have to be born again. So I think this intense desire to be someone else, to be better than we are, to reinvent ourselves, that is a natural desire because we're broken under the curse of sin. But the solution is not to be transgender. The solution is to give our life to Jesus in order that he can renew us and transform us. The Bible says that anyone who is in Christ is a new creature. Old things have passed away, and behold, all things have become new. So
Yep.
that desire to be someone else, to be better than who we are, that's a God-given desire in this sinful world. God doesn't want us to be satisfied with who we are, but the solution is to give our life to Jesus.
Yeah, so well said. I kind of like to end on that note, but I want to ask you one more thing here. For parents or policymakers at the UN or United States or other countries, what advice would you give on protecting children from rushed care and ensuring that they get full information on risks and harms, essentially truly informed consent? What advice would you have for parents or policymakers in regard to that topic or question?
First of all, no child should be able to consent to medical transition. We don't allow children under a certain age. And of course, the laws are going to vary by country. But here in the U.S., kids are not even allowed to drink under 21, alcohol
Right.
under 21 years old. They're not allowed to get tattoos, I think, under 18. Not allowed to
Even
vote
ear
under
even
the
ear
age of 18.
piercings have to be approved by parents, right?
Right, right. But somehow kids can even, in a lot of states, kids can go to Planned Parenthood behind the parents' back and get hormone treatments without the parents' knowledge.
Yeah.
But just like in my case, I knew that I would not be able to have children in the future, but that wasn't really a big deal when I was single, and especially not as a teenager. Most teenage girls don't want to be pregnant at 16 years old.
Yep.
So that's not a big deal. They're saying, oh, I don't really care about having kids, but they can't understand what that's like to give up
That's right.
before that desire is truly awakened. And so I think kids cannot consent to that. So I really advocate for no child medical transition. Studies have shown in the past that even social transition is pushes a child toward medical transition.
Yes.
Studies back by Kenneth Zucker back in, I think it was the 80s, showed that around 90% of children, if they were not socially affirmed, if they were not given a new identity and allowed to dress as the opposite sex, if they were put in counseling and therapy, about 90% would desist or no longer say they were trans.
Mm-hmm.
But now, if kids are being socially affirmed, if they're given a new identity, they're allowed to dress as the opposite sex, huge majorities are going on to medical transition. And those that get on puberty blockers, studies have shown 95 to 100%, depending on the study, have gone on to medical transition. And so it's the complete opposite. So I really advocate for therapy and getting kids the help that they need. And also helping kids understand that all of us have things we don't like about our bodies. All of us have things we don't like about ourselves, and helping kids see the needs of others rather than being so hyper-focused on self. Because I think all of this extreme introspection, thinking about our feelings every day, thinking about what's wrong with us all day, every day, is extremely harmful.
That's so good. So good. So how can people follow you, find you, get your book, that kind of thing?
Yeah, you can follow us at edensredemption.org on our website, or social media. We have Eden's Redemption on Instagram and Facebook. And we are getting ready, hopefully, to release this week, very soon, a podcast for parents. So check that out as well. We'll post it on our social media, but we really want to help parents through this journey. So we're really excited. We're working on that content. So we have a parent support group. You can reach out to us, and we will be making some more resources in the future. But we really have a heart for the parents that have reached out to us. So reach out to us on social media.
Sounds good. Sounds good. Well, hey, everybody, thank you so much for joining us for another episode of the Love and Truth Network podcast. We're glad that you're here. I know that you enjoyed listening to and receiving from Laura Perry Smaltz, and we're excited again for the work that God's doing through her husband, and just, again, through her life story and what God's done in and through her. Thank you, Laura, again, for being with us.
Thank you so much for having me. It's been a pleasure.
Hey, thanks so much for joining us for the Love and Truth Network podcast. We hope that the stories and insights shared have ignited in you a sense of God's powerful love for you and given you encouragement for your own journey toward relational and sexual wholeness. Remember, transformation is absolutely possible when rooted in grace, truth, and authentic biblical community. Subscribe today, share with a friend, share with your pastor, and we look forward to seeing you in our next Love and Truth Network podcast.